A perennial plant is one that lasts more than a few years, often coming back every spring. Perennial issues are also ones that never seem to go away, never seem to be resolved. Dialogues, debates, discussions that keep coming back. One reason ancient stories may still excite us today is that they address questions that still drive us forward, that are at the roots maybe of humanity. The editors of your textbook say in the introduction to chapter 1 about world literature, we know its relevance because of the controversies it inspires. Some of those contrasts that we see in that introductory chapter, that introduction to chapter 1, I'd like to talk about with you. The first one is the difference between an oral tradition and written literature, a written language, which is literature. And today that issue is very familiar to us as we look at popular culture, and we see sometimes there's a struggle between coming to grips with what is high culture and what is low culture. The oral tradition was, of course, the more ancient way, and it was sprawling, based in community, shared person to person, passed on generation to generation. And often they were shared stories that just became sprawling because of being added to and based in the community and with many different contributors. That's very different from the neatly organized stories composed by a single author, written down. We might even say written in stone and unchanging, more associated with elite and high culture than the lower folk traditions. Another difference is that there were permutations. The stories would change as they're passed on from one local community to another, and again, not set in stone. So we value literature, but yet there's a component in the ancient literature that's closer to the roots of those folk traditions sometimes. As we look at some of the ancient stories, the second contrast that your introduction brings up is between ancient culture, society, and religion, and our more modern lifestyle and our modern understandings. And some of them are very practical. For example, slavery was a part of life. If you read the old Bible stories, and the ancient literature, it was built in to the caste system and the societies at the time. In modern culture, we have industrialization and machines that do many things for us, automation, and so we have a completely different scenario. Also, the ancient cultures were more regional. Now, the textbook talks about how cultures developed around water, the Nile River, the Fertile Crescent, where the Euphrates River and the Tigris River came there in the Mediterranean area and the Near East there. And though there was some cultural exchange through trade and travel, that region wasn't a cohesive whole as we know in today's modern global society with all in our information age and our communications that we have today. So we know that a McDonald's in Beijing is exactly the same as a McDonald's restaurant in Moscow or in New York City. And that's a feature of globalization. Another difference is that religions were also very local, and so there were local deities, and polytheism was common. Whereas today the great world religions, the most widespread ones, are monotheistic, whether Buddhism or Judaism, Christianity. There's a tendency to see one God rather than many. Also, the concern of religion in ancient times seemed to be more focused on ritual and the acts of serving the community, what scholars might call orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy. And in the modern time, we would have much more focus on doctrine and what is true. And so in ancient times, there's a lot of diversity in the myths from one local area to another. In more modern times, alternative versions of religion are often called heretical. And so this is a different mindset. The third contrast I want to mention is between two city-states talked about in your textbook's introduction to Chapter 1 in Greece. And there was the city-state of Sparta, and then there was Attica, of which Athens was a featured city. And they had very different cultures, and this kind of contrast is still, in our polarized society today, still a perennial issue. So Sparta was much more conservative. There was a rule by the few. The elite governed that city-state of Sparta, and we call that an oligarchy. They were military-driven and had rigid traditions. Athens, on the other hand, was more liberal, and there was an attempt at a democracy or rule by the people. Now, it wasn't perfect, as I'm sure ours is not today, but women, the poor were left out and had no power, but there was an attempt of a rule by the people at that time. They were more civic-minded or civilian-driven, and invention and innovation seemed to be more a feature than the military might. So you can see more description in your textbook about the difference between these two city-states. The final contrast I want to leave you with, and a perennial issue, was a contrast between the Greek culture and the Roman culture, which in some ways developed from that culture. The Greek culture, we would say, focuses on individualism, perhaps, whereas the Roman culture was more focused on unity and collectivism. The group was more important. The individual served the state more than the state serving the individual, with this contrast. Freedom was more important to the Greek understanding, whereas in the Roman culture, duty was more important, and the special word for that was pietas, and seriousness was very important, and the special word for that, gravitas. Whereas the Greek culture was more idealistic, much philosophical thought, the arts and sciences, the gymnasiums, the theaters. The Roman culture seemed much more practical, pragmatic, and we can see that in the development of sewers and roads, bathhouses, the aqueduct, and the discipline and control it took to bring those things into practice. Your textbook discusses the different ideas of conflict that we can see in those two cultures. In the Greek culture, conflict was often seen as healthy competition. We can see this in the Olympic Games, for example. The Roman culture perhaps saw conflict more as a threat, a danger, and so uniformity and military training were more at the forefront. So those are some ideas to keep in mind, and look for those perennial issues, contrasts, and dialogues, debates, discussions that still breed controversy today. Thank you for listening, and good luck with your studies.